I was born and raised in Pakistan and have lived most of my adult life in China. So I have spent most of my life outside of my what we would call my passport country, which means that I have a lot of experience in living where I don't belong. Whether I've lived well or not, I think can be open to debate. And so in this lecture, we're going to talk about this concept of living well where you don't belong. What does it look like to live in a place where you don't belong? Now, belonging has really two types of meanings. Belonging is a feeling of how I feel about a place, usually associated with my home, usually associated with all of those things that are familiar. But belonging also has another aspect, is how do the outsiders view me? And when I go to China, as I've talked before, which is an insider-outsider culture, as a foreigner in China, I automatically am in a place that I don't belong. And if you go into a Chinese small town or village, suddenly you draw a crowd. You have an immediate sense of, wow, I don't belong here. So the question we're trying to ask today is, what does it look to live well where I don't belong? Because we all know how to live well at home because we know the rules, we know how to get things done, but suddenly we're in an unfamiliar environment where everything is different and it's going to look differently. So what are the things that we can do to live well in a situation where we actually don't belong, at least on the part of the locals? And what I want to do is to highlight 10 tips for living well where you don't belong. The first one is tolerate ambiguity. Now, the dictionary says that ambiguity is that state or condition of uncertainty. You don't know what's going on around you. And when you get to China, when you get in any culture where you don't know the rules, this is sort of going to be a permanent state of affairs. You're going to find yourself in China where the language is different, the customs are different, society is structured different, it's all opaque. You just don't know what's going on around you. And this can be a major source of culture stress and culture shock. And we're all hardwired differently. Some people naturally have a low tolerance of ambiguity. Some people naturally have a high tolerance of ambiguity. Quite honestly, if you're the type of person who doesn't tolerate ambiguity well, China is probably going to be a fairly frustrating experience for you because you're not going to know what's going on around you most of the time. Those of us who, like myself, have a very high tolerance of ambiguity, we kind of walk around and everything's an adventure. Everything is going to be some new, exciting adventure. I don't know what's going to go on. And I really think that living successfully in China where you don't belong, it's very important to cultivate a tolerance of ambiguity. Even if your ambiguity tolerance is lower on this scale, I do believe that you can bring it up and try to get to that place where you can say, I don't have a clue what's going on, and that's okay. The second point about living well where you don't belong is in the area of change. One of my favorite books about China is written by Jonathan Spence, and it's called To Change China. In this book, he chronicles the lives of about half a dozen foreigners who came to China from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, all with the goal of changing China. They came to China to serve, to bring about change in the areas of education or the military or industry or politics. And in all of the cases, China chewed them up and spit them out. And so for anybody serving in China, it's a good cautionary tale. And I think one of the key lessons of the book is that China has been around for a long, long time. They've been around for about 5,000 years, and they have their own ways of doing things. And they're not going to change just because me, a sincere, good-hearted, well-intentioned foreigner, has showed up. And so it's very important to remember that the burden of change when you cross another culture is on you, not on the local culture. And so we need to be examining ourselves. What are areas that I need to change and not just the locals need to change? There's another book by a man named Craig Storti called The Art of Crossing Cultures. And in it, he says that when we adjust to another culture, we're really adjusting to two things. We adjust to the behaviors and attitudes and values of the locals that annoy us and upset us, but we also have to adjust our behaviors and our attitudes that annoy and unsettle the locals. And so as you prepare to go to China, I really encourage you to think about those things, think about those behaviors, those attitudes, those ways of doing things that you have that you're going to have to change when you get to China. The third important thing is to view everything as a privilege and not an entitlement. Particularly Americans, we come with a really strong sense of entitlement. I have a right to this, I have a right to that. And even to the point now, it seems like in American society, we believe we have a right not to be offended. And this attitude of entitlement is going to be, if it's really strong in you, it's going to be a barrier to living well and living successfully and being effective in the work that you're called to do in China. Many of these rights that we as Americans or those of us from other Western countries that have a lot of freedoms, which of course we are grateful for, they're simply not transferable to China. In the United States particularly, we speak our mind about politics, about a lot of different subjects, but we just can't do that in China. So it's important to be willing and able to set aside some of the rights that we have. Maybe it's not just, oh, I have a right to speak freely, but I'm not entitled to efficiency. I'm not necessarily entitled to having hot water every day coming out of my pipes for 24 hours. And I think when we find ourselves in situations where we don't have those, we realize how much we view them as entitlements. I think it's very important to leave behind, when we go to China, to leave behind our notions of entitlement and what I'm entitled to, and view everything as a privilege. And I also think that it's only when we leave behind a sense of entitlement can we view everything as a privilege, even the hard things. Because the reality is, if you're called to China and God has brought you there and He's given you a job to do and a task to do and you're there to serve Him, really everything is going to be a privilege. And it's just a good way to walk through the day and say, boy, God, I'm really glad to be here, even if it's a hard day. The fourth tip for living well where you don't belong is this: don't take yourself too seriously. It's really important in China to cultivate and maintain a sense of humor. I remember in some of my early years in China back in the 1980s, I had a difficult, my second year of China was very, very difficult. And I realized that by the end of the second year, I had lost my sense of humor, which was a big deal to me because I like to laugh and I like to make other people laugh as well. And it was really only several years later when I began to see my humor come back that I thought, okay, now I'm on the road. I'm on the road to recovery. But it's important to maintain a sense of humor. There's a lot of funny things that happen in China every day if you keep your eyes open. I also think it's important to remember in this area that sometimes we are the source of humor to the locals around us, to the people around us. Maybe just walking down the street or going into a store and buying something will be entertaining to the locals. I used to have a teammate, in fact, who said that he thought that one of the functions of foreigners in Chinese society was to provide entertainment for the locals. Many years ago, I worked with a team in China, and they had a team motto, which I thought was very, very helpful. They said, if you're going to laugh later, you might as well go ahead and laugh now. And I think that's a very helpful thing. Just don't take yourself too seriously in China. You probably get too stressed out. The fifth piece of advice I would give is view cultural mistakes as opportunities to learn. The reality is, whenever you cross a cultural boundary, whenever you live in another culture, you are going to make cultural mistakes. It's just going to happen. You're going to say something that's offensive. You're going to use the wrong word. You're going to butcher the language. You're going to do something. But the good news is that in general, well, not in general, cultural mistakes are not fatal. Unless, of course, in China you cross the street in the wrong way, then it could be fatal. But generally speaking, this is one of the things I love about China, is that they're very, very gracious to foreigners who they see as trying to learn their language and trying to learn their culture. And so what you need to do is, when you make cultural mistakes, don't freak out. Don't run back to your room and say, oh, I shouldn't be here. I'm such a disaster at this. Stop, take a minute, take a few minutes, maybe get a cultural informant to say, hey, what happened here? And learn from the mistakes so the next time you don't make it again. The sixth piece of advice that I would like to give is this: limit yourself to one why question per day. For some reason, whenever we get into a new situation that's unfamiliar and we don't know the rules and we don't know what's going on, it's a very natural thing to ask the question, why? One of my favorite Hong Kong movies back from the 1970s is this funny madcap Hong Kong comedy called Peking Opera Blues. And in it, there's this scene, because Hong Kong movies are lots of gangsters, and they run into this garage, and there's dead bodies everywhere, and one of the principal characters looks around the room, and the subtitle at the bottom was translated in English. It was so funny. It just says, "Why is it like this?" And that is a question that will just rise over and over again as you're in China, as you see things that are done differently than you would do them at home, and you don't understand why they said this. Why is it? You just find yourself saying, why is it like this? Now, why questions in and of themselves are not negative, because the question why, a little child, a little 3-year-old who's out constantly asking, Mommy, why? They're trying to learn. They may annoy Mommy, but they're really trying to learn. So why questions can be done out of a sincere desire to learn, and that's okay. But what I've also found in China is that it's really easy for a why question to slide from being a desire to learn to being a rant, and just being another way of saying, this is how they do it in China, and I don't like that. So you have to be very, very careful. And so I found over the years, particularly for people who are new to China, is to be very, very careful about over asking the question, why is it like this? And so one of the things I suggest is just say to yourself or your teammates or your coworkers, we're only allowed to ask one why question each day. The 7th piece of advice is to strive to be an acceptable outsider. And I really like this term. I learned it from Don Larson, who was a linguist and cross-cultural trainer back in the 70s and 80s. And he came up with this concept of being an acceptable outsider. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, Chinese culture is an insider-outsider culture. And I can't assimilate, I can't become Chinese. Really, the best I can do is become an acceptable outsider, an outsider within the community who the people around say, she's interesting, she's worth listening to. Because at the end of the day, if the locals that I'm interacting with don't want to interact with me, then my chances of being effective in the work that I'm called to do are pretty low. So I think that an important part of living well where you don't belong, in a Chinese context especially, is to come to terms with being a permanent outsider and figure out not how do I become Chinese, but how do I become an acceptable outsider? And that can take many, many different forms. The 8th piece of advice is to cultivate a habit of observation. Pay attention. Again, I go back to Don Larson because he was a great influence on my life in this area of cross-cultural adjustment, is that he used to say, nothing never happens. And I love that quote because it's true. Nothing never happens. In other words, if you keep your eyes open, you're likely to see something interesting. And that's especially true in a country like China, where so much of life is lived out on the street. Everything happens outdoors. Everything happens on the street. Something interesting is happening. When I go out on the street here in the U.S., I don't see anybody. There's a lot of nothing happening, and it seems to me there's a lot of nothing happening anyway, but that's not true. But especially in China, where there's so much going on, nothing never happens, and it's really tempting if you don't know the language, if the cultural rules are unfamiliar to you, maybe you're just overwhelmed by it all. It's really easy when you go out to put on your headphones, to bury your nose in a book if you're riding on a bus. And if you do that, you miss so much of what goes on around you. So I would just encourage you, make sure that when you're out and about, you're being observant, that you're noticing patterns. What is the traffic like? What are people wearing? What kind of books are people reading? What kind of newspapers are in the stalls? What food is on the grocery store shelves? You can actually learn a lot about the culture that way, and especially if you're really observant, just write things down and go back and ask a Chinese friend, hey, can you explain this to me? But you won't be able to learn those things if you're not observant, so take out your earbuds and pay attention. Number 9 is don't take things too personally. China is a culture, as I've said in another lecture, where there's a lot of direct communication in areas that we are used to indirect communication, and the chances of you being offended by something a Chinese person says or does is very, very high in China. And I would just encourage you to remember that Chinese aren't setting out to, they're not setting out to offend you, they're not setting out to cause offense, to be rude. They just have a different communication style. And so it's important, to the best of your ability, to lower your sort of take offense filter and get it down as low as you can, so that you're not interpreting things that people say that are different and they're things that nobody back home would ever say. Try not to interpret them as, oh, they're offending me, they're being rude to me. Chinese people, for example, you'll be scolded. by perfect strangers. Perfect strangers in the winter, especially, well, all over China because it's cold. Perfect strangers will come up to you and scold you for not wearing enough clothes. If you're a mom and you've taken your baby out for a walk, the grannies will encircle you and give you a good scolding because you're not taking care of the baby correctly. Now, that would be very offensive in our culture, but in China, scolding, telling people what to do, wear more clothes, drink more hot water, don't do this, don't do that, that's just a Chinese way of communicating, I care about you. I care about you enough to say something. Try not to take offense. There's this great quote. I have no idea where it came from. I've been using it for years. And it goes like this: thicken your skin without hardening your heart. And I think that's a really good piece of advice for China. You have to have a thick skin to live in China, but you also don't want it to get so thick that you have a hard heart. Finally, be flexible. China is a country that will drive you crazy if you're the type of person that schedules everything down to the minute and has your, well, in the old days we said day timer, but now everything's scheduled on your iPhone calendar. And because plans change in China. In fact, one of my absolute favorite Chinese sayings goes like this: 计划没有变化快. And translated, it means plans cannot keep up with changes. And when I learned that, I was studying with a tutor many years ago, and when she told me this, it was just like, oh, that explains so much. That explains so much of my source of frustration. I would make plans, then the school officials would come and say, there's something different, and we would have to change it. And it, particularly for Westerners and for Americans and for individuals who are really, really rigid on their schedule and like to plan everything out, China can be quite frustrating. And I find it interesting that China, the language has many, many ways to say make a plan, carry out a plan, do a plan, but in fact, sticking to plans is very difficult. And if you find yourself, for example, in an educational setting in China, and for example, you're a teacher, as the semester begins, it's quite possible, in fact, it's quite likely, that the school does not know when the semester is going to end. And that's incomprehensible for most of us in the West. How can you not know when the school semester is going to end? And so you need to, it's okay to make plans in China. Go ahead and make your plans, but you've got to hold them loosely. And maybe you have plans with some friends, maybe you have plans with students or coworkers, but somebody of higher rank or status comes in and wants your time, you're going to have to give that up for them. And it doesn't matter what your plans were, you're going to have to change them. So for those of you who like to procrastinate, China, unfortunately, will feed into that because there's this thought, well, why should I make a plan? It's going to be changed anyway. But you do need to keep your plans flexible if you're going to function well and live well in China. And so hopefully these 10 tips are helpful for you as you begin to prepare for your sojourn in China, that it's not easy, but it is possible to live well where you don't belong.